On Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted scheduled American television broadcasts to deliver an emergency nationwide address that permanently reshaped global economic history. Speaking live from the Oval Office, Nixon announced a sweeping series of unprecedented economic measures designed to combat rising inflation and defend American industry from foreign competition. The most consequential declaration in that broadcast was hidden behind technical monetary jargon: the temporary suspension of a U.S. dollar's convertibility into physical gold. Without warning international allies or consulting foreign central bankers, the United States unilaterally dismantled the foundational pillar of the post-World War II global monetary system. That temporary emergency policy became permanent, demolishing the Bretton Woods monetary framework, severing the 5,000-year link between paper money and precious metals, and birthing today's global fiat currency regime. To fully grasp how the modern financial world was transformed on a single summer weekend, we must travel back to July 1944 in the picturesque White Mountains of New Hampshire. Delegates from 44 allied nations convened at the Grand Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods to architect a stable monetary order for the post-war world. The economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, coupled with devastating hyperinflations and competitive currency devaluations during the 1930s, had utterly destroyed international commerce. With Europe and Asia laid waste by war, the United States possessed unparalleled economic dominance and held over 20,000 metric tons of gold, representing roughly two-thirds of the world's official gold reserves. Because no other nation possessed sufficient physical bullion to back its currency, Allied negotiators agreed to place the U.S. dollar at the center of global trade. Under the historic Bretton Woods Agreement, the United States made a binding international commitment to anchor monetary stability by fixing the price of gold at 35 paper dollars per troy ounce. Foreign central banks were granted the legal right to convert 35 paper U.S. dollars into 1 troy ounce of physical fine gold directly from the United States Treasury upon demand. All other foreign currencies were then pegged at fixed exchange rates to the U.S. dollar, effectively making the American currency the official proxy for physical gold worldwide. For nearly 2 decades, the Bretton Woods structure functioned remarkably well, fostering rapid global economic reconstruction, stable exchange rates, and booming international investment across the Western Alliance. However, buried deep within the architecture of Bretton Woods was a fatal structural contradiction that would eventually pull the entire system apart. In 1960, Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin exposed this flaw in testimony before the United States Congress, formulating what became famously known as Triffin's dilemma. Triffin explained that to satisfy the growing liquidity demands of an expanding global economy, the United States had to supply the world with a continuous stream of U.S. dollars. The only way the United States could distribute those dollars globally was by running persistent foreign trade and capital account deficits year after year. American corporations, investors, and the federal government exported billions of paper dollars overseas to purchase foreign goods, fund foreign aid, and build military bases abroad. However, as overseas paper dollar reserves grew exponentially to facilitate global trade, those claims began to far outstrip the physical gold reserves stored in American vaults. Triffin warned that if the U.S. eliminated its trade deficits, global trade would choke for lack of liquidity. But if the deficits continued, global confidence in dollar convertibility would inevitably collapse. Throughout the 1960s, Triffin's prophecy began to unfold in real time as federal spending escalated under President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs and the expanding Vietnam War. To finance these massive domestic and foreign commitments without raising taxes to politically unpopular levels, the United States government relied heavily on debt issuance and Federal Reserve monetary expansion. As the U.S. money supply expanded rapidly, American inflation began to rise, eroding the real domestic purchasing power of paper dollars circulating both at home and abroad. Foreign central bankers who held billions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves watched with growing alarm as the purchasing power of their dollar assets steadily deteriorated. French President Charles de Gaulle was among the first European statesmen to openly challenge America's monetary dominance and accuse the United States of exploiting the system. In a famous 1965 press conference at the Élysée Palace, de Gaulle condemned what his finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing termed America's exorbitant privilege. De Gaulle pointed out that the Bretton Woods framework allowed the United States to purchase real foreign companies, factories, and commodities simply by printing paper currency that cost nothing to produce. Determined to restore European financial autonomy, de Gaulle ordered the French central bank to aggressively convert its accumulated U.S. dollar reserves into physical gold bullion. French warships were literally dispatched across the Atlantic Ocean to transport tons of physical gold from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York back to vaults in Paris. Seeing France successfully exchange paper dollars for gold, other major nations including West Germany, Switzerland, Spain, and Belgium quickly initiated their own gold conversions. To prevent the gold price from surging above $35 on private markets, 8 Western central banks formed the London Gold Pool in 1961, pooling their bullion reserves to defend the fixed price. By 1968, heavy private buying and relentless foreign central bank redemptions forced the London Gold Pool to collapse, establishing a two-tiered market where private gold traded freely above $35. Between 1957 and 1970, official U.S. Treasury gold holdings plummeted from over 20,000 metric tons down to barely 9,000 metric tons. Meanwhile, liquid dollar liabilities held by foreign central banks ballooned to over $40 billion, exceeding America's remaining gold stock by a factor of 3 to 1. By the spring of 1971, international currency markets reached a breaking point as speculative runs against the overvalued dollar triggered massive capital flight into European currencies. In May 1971, the West German Bundesbank was forced to absorb billions of unwanted U.S. dollars in a single week to maintain the fixed exchange rate before finally surrendering and allowing the Deutsche Mark to float. The final breaking point arrived in early August 1971 when a British embassy in Washington delivered a formal diplomatic request to the U.S. Treasury. The United Kingdom requested that the United States cover $3 billion of British dollar reserves by delivering physical gold bullion from American vaults. The British request signaled to senior White House officials that a catastrophic international run on America's remaining gold reserves was imminent within days. President Richard Nixon realized that if foreign nations exercised their contractual rights, Fort Knox would be emptied, forcing the United States into open monetary bankruptcy. On Friday afternoon, August 13th, 1971, Nixon secretly assembled his top economic team for an emergency weekend summit at the presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland. 16 high-ranking officials, including Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Undersecretary Paul Volcker, and economist George Shultz, gathered in complete seclusion. To prevent panic on Wall Street and forestall market speculation, the attendees were strictly prohibited from communicating with their staff, the press, or their families. Inside the meeting rooms, a heated philosophical battle erupted over the future direction of American monetary policy and international relations. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns passionately fought to preserve the gold link, arguing that closing the gold window would destroy American credibility, spark worldwide financial chaos, and trigger unchecked global inflation. In contrast, Treasury Secretary John Connally, a formidable Texan politician, aggressively advocated for a hardline policy that put American domestic interests first. Connally argued that the United States should close the gold window immediately, impose domestic wage and price controls, and slap a 10% tariff on all foreign imports to force trading partners to revalue their currencies. Connally famously insisted that American economic policy must no longer be dictated by foreign central banks or international agreements. President Nixon ultimately sided with Connolly's nationalistic strategy, recognizing that domestic unemployment and inflation posed an immediate threat to his upcoming 1972 re-election campaign. Speechwriters worked feverishly through Saturday night to draft the presidential address, carefully framing the radical policy shift as a bold defense of American prosperity. When Nixon took the screen on Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, he unveiled his new economic policy before a captive television audience of over 40 million citizens. Nixon instructed Treasury Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets for foreign governments. He reassured the American public that their dollars would remain fully backed by the strength of the U.S. economy, placing the blame for monetary instability on international financial speculators. Nixon also announced a 90-day freeze on domestic wages and prices, along with a 10% tax surcharge on imported goods to protect domestic manufacturing. When financial markets opened on Monday morning, August 16th, Wall Street reacted with euphoric celebration, driving the Dow Jones Industrial Average up by its largest single-day point gain in history. However, overseas governments and central bankers were stunned and deeply angered by the unilateral American decision, which shattered the rules of international monetary order without prior consultation. When European finance ministers complained bitterly about the severe disruption caused by floating exchange rates, Treasury Secretary Connally famously delivered his iconic response: "The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem." In December 1971, representatives from 10 leading industrial nations gathered at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington to attempt a frantic restructuring of the global monetary framework. The resulting Smithsonian agreement devalued the U.S. dollar by nearly 8% against gold, setting the official price at $38 per ounce and widening allowable currency trading bands. President Nixon enthusiastically proclaimed the agreement to be the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world, but the fragile compromise crumbled within 15 months. Persistent trade imbalances, continuous money printing, and unstoppable market speculation forced central banks to abandon fixed exchange rates completely in March 1973. From that moment onward, the world transitioned fully to a system of floating fiat currencies, where exchange values were determined solely by market supply, demand, and central bank management. The complete removal of gold backing detached currency creation from physical limits, granting governments and central banks unlimited capability to expand money and credit. The initial economic consequence of this unanchored fiat regime was the severe stagflation of the 1970s, characterized by soaring inflation rates, economic stagnation, and compounding oil shocks. As the U.S. dollar lost domestic purchasing power throughout the decade, consumer prices surged, eventually forcing Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker to raise benchmark interest rates to a record 20% in 1980 to crush inflation. To sustain global demand for the dollar after gold convertibility ended, the United States negotiated a landmark strategic alliance with Saudi Arabia in 1974. Under what became known as the petrodollar system, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its global crude oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars and invest surplus revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States provided Saudi Arabia with comprehensive military protection, advanced arms sales, and a guarantee of regime security. Because every industrialized nation on Earth required crude oil to power its economy, the petrodollar agreement created perpetual global demand for U.S. paper currency. Over the past 5 decades since the Nixon shock, global fiat money supply and government debt have exploded at speeds unprecedented in monetary history. In August 1971, total U.S. national debt stood at less than $400 billion. Today, federal debt has surpassed $35 trillion and continues to grow exponentially. Since Nixon closed the gold window, the U.S. dollar has lost over 85% of its domestic purchasing power, demonstrating the cumulative impact of persistent monetary expansion. Defenders of the fiat system argue that unanchored currencies provide central banks with vital flexibility to combat economic recessions, inject emergency liquidity, and manage complex financial crises. Conversely, critics contend that fiat money enables fiscal irresponsibility, encourages unsustainable debt accumulation, inflates asset bubbles, and subtly transfers wealth from wage earners to asset owners through inflation. In recent years, mounting geopolitical fragmentation, escalating national debt burdens, and weaponized currency sanctions have prompted many nations to diversify away from exclusive reliance on the U.S. dollar. Central banks around the world have been purchasing physical gold bullion at the fastest rate in modern recording history, seeking an uncancelable reserve asset with no counterparty risk. 55 years after Nixon announced a temporary suspension, the global financial system remains grounded in the floating fiat model created during that historic weekend at Camp David. Understanding the mechanics of fiat currency creation, inflation, and sovereign debt is essential for anyone navigating the modern economic landscape and protecting long-term purchasing power. Always remember that this video is for educational and historical analysis, not financial or investment advice. Thank you for watching Chronicle. If you enjoyed this deep dive into financial history,